Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's panel, Feminists Against Empire, Resistance to US Sanctions and Embargoes. My name is Diana Sierra Becerra. I'm a popular educator and assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts. I will be your moderator this evening. Tonight's event will be bilingual. Please select the globe icon on the bottom of your screen to hear interpretation into English and Spanish. English closed captions are also available, and I will now greet our Spanish listeners. Buenas noches y bienvenidos al evento Feministas contra el Imperio, Resistencia, las Sanciones y Bloqueos Estadounidenses. Mi nombre es Diana Sierra Becerra, soy educadora popular, historiadora en la Universidad de Massachusetts. Seré su moderadora esta noche. Este evento será bilingüe. Por favor, seleccione el icono del globo bajo la pantalla para escuchar interpretación simultánea al español y al inglés. Tonight's panel is part of the 2022-2023 Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series. This year's theme is Confronting Empire, which explores histories of US imperialism and anti-imperialist resistance. The series is presented by the UMass History Department in collaboration with the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy and more than 24 community partners and sponsors. And the series is made possible thanks to the generosity of UMass History alumnus Kenneth Feinberg and Associates. I would also like to draw attention to the chat, where you can also see the work of our important community partners, the Anti-Imperialist Action Committee, and the Trans Asylum Support Network. You can also see the chat for more information about captions, interpretation, student attendance, and about the series and the event for tonight. Tonight, our panelists Liz Oliva Fernández and Alejandra Laprea will discuss the impacts of US policy on their respective countries, Cuba and Venezuela. Our panelists will also discuss the creativity of the Cuban and Venezuelan people, their will to survive, resist, and create feminist alternatives to US economic policies of death and suffering. It is an honor to introduce our panelists. Liz Oliva Fernández is an award-winning Cuban journalist and producer with Belly of the Beast. She has won a Gracie Award and was co-winner of the One World Media Award for her work on the documentary series, The War on Cuba. Apart from her journalism and her filmmaking, Liz is a dedicated anti-racist and feminist activist. I would now like for our tech team to please show the trailer to The War on Cuba.
People come to Havana looking for the real Cuba.
But this is not my Cuba.
We've got one huge problem: the economy. The United States has been waging war against Cuba for 60 years.
Impacta cada aspecto de nuestra vida.
Estas son de aluminio y fibra de plástico. Existen unas prótesis más resistentes, con más calidad, pero el gobierno americano no deja que la compren.
The Trump administration has killed a deal that would allow Cuban baseball players to play for Major League Baseball.
En caso de que tú quisieras jugar con la MLB,
tendría que renunciar a mi país, no me gustaría, la verdad.
Trump administration is imposing new restrictions on U.S. travel to Cuba.
Tourism stopped. You are suffocating the Cuban people.
Thank you to Liz and her colleagues for their powerful journalism. We encourage all of our listeners to watch the entire series. I now want to welcome our second incredible panelist, Alejandra Laprea. Alejandra is a member of Las Yerbeteras Collective, the World Women's March, and the Feminist Spider, a network of collectives. She leads a community garden called the Conoco Argelia Laya, and organizes actions on feminist economy and strategy as alternatives to the capitalist, patriarchal, and colonial systems. She also promotes women's artistic creations, including film and poetry, and Alejandra received her training as a social communicator at the Andrés Bello Catholic University Catholic University, and also in the arts at the Central University of Venezuela. She works professionally as a documentary filmmaker, and you can see the chat for a full list of her incredible films and accomplishments. Before we hear from our amazing panelists, I would like to briefly discuss the history of US imperialism toward Cuba and Venezuela. In January 1959, students, workers, and peasants overthrew the US-backed dictatorship of Batista in Cuba. The revolution inherited massive inequalities, product of a centuries-old sugar economy with roots in slavery and colonialism. As a result, revolutionaries prioritized healthcare, education, and a radical redistribution of resources. Black peasants and working-class women played a key role, pushing the top leadership to confront land, racial, and gender inequality. In May of 1959, the revolution implemented agrarian reform. It seized farms with more than 3,333 acres and compensated the owners according to the amount that they had declared on their tax returns. The reform hurt the interests of US capitalists who controlled the Cuban economy. In response, the US imposed a full trade embargo on Cuba in 1962, which has been in place now for over 60 years. Cubans call the embargo a bloqueo or blockade. The US blockade is a form of economic warfare and collective punishment intended to make the Cuban economy collapse. In the 1970s, a CIA officer said, quote, "We wanted to keep bread out of the stores so people were hungry," unquote. In depriving Cubans of goods and medicines, the US hopes to foment dissent to overthrow the government. The blockade punishes those who have economic relations with Cuba. For instance, the US charges millions of dollars in fees to banks that do business with Cuba. And as a result, the blockade has cost the Cuban economy billions of dollars and has forced tens of thousands of Cubans, especially young Cubans, to migrate. The blockade intensifies inequality and contradictions on the island. This makes it harder for Cubans, including those to the left of the government, to organize. And US policy has not been limited to economic warfare. In 1961, the US funded and trained a failed invasion of the island known as the Bay of Pigs. And since then, the US has funded right-wing dissidents and terrorist organizations that have bombed civilians and infrastructure. I would now like the tech team to please play a clip from episode 5 of The War on Cuba, which explains this history a bit further.
Si el fracaso económico es solo debido al gobierno cubano, ¿qué sentido tiene el bloqueo? In April 1960, a State Department memo proposed that the United States should deny money and supplies to Cuba to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. In 1962, John F. Kennedy followed that advice, imposing a full trade embargo on Cuba. 60 years later, the embargo is still in place, and it's even more far-reaching. In Cuba, we call it the blockade. The blockade isn't just between Cuba and the United States, it's global. In 1992, the Territorial Act blocked any ship that docks in Cuba from entering a US port for 6 months, and it banned foreign subsidiaries of US companies from trading with Cuba. Democratic Senator Robert Torricelli said the act was meant to wreak havoc on the island. 4 years later, Bill Clinton signed a law designed to stop foreign investment in Cuba called the Helms-Burton Act. Under Barack Obama, the US government began fining European banks billions of dollars for processing transactions involving Cuba and other countries. Donald Trump imposed an avalanche of sanctions, further isolating Cuba from the US and the rest of the world. If this wasn't enough, just before leaving office, Trump put Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list.
Thank you. Working class Venezuelans have also organized to democratize their society. Venezuela has been historically dependent on the export of a few goods, mainly oil. And in 1998, popular resistance to neoliberalism paved the way for the election of Hugo Chavez. Chavez used oil revenue to fund social service programs, and he nationalized several other key industries that had been in private or foreign hands. Organizers seized the political opening under Chavez to expand participatory and direct democracy, building thousands of communal councils. In the councils, ordinary people democratically decide what to produce, how to distribute state resources, and manage social conflicts. People collectively make decisions without bureaucrats and capitalists. These councils also represent an alternative to capitalism and state bureaucracy. And as of 2020, there are about over 1,000 active communes operating in the country. Working class leftists have also defended Venezuela's right to national sovereignty, resisting US-led coups in 2002 and 2019. And organizers understand that a right-wing coup is a death sentence for leftists and their political projects. At the same time, many communes are deeply critical of the ruling socialist PSUV party in Venezuela and the state as a whole, including its bureaucracy and corruption. In fact, many communes wage a daily fight to put state resources under community control. In 2014, August 2017, and January 2019, the US imposed sanctions against Venezuela. According to a 2019 report by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, the first year of the sanctions alone resulted in the deaths of 40,000 people. As of now, the estimates are about 100,000 deaths since the sanctions. In the words of the report, quote, "The sanctions reduced the public's caloric intake, increased disease and mortality for both adults and infants, and displaced millions of Venezuelans who fled the country as a result of the worsening economic depression and hyperinflation. They exacerbated Venezuela's economic crisis and made it nearly impossible to stabilize the economy, contributing to further excess debts," unquote. These sanctions are a form of collective punishment against civilians and a violation of international law under both the Geneva and Hague Conventions, to which the US is a signatory. I would now like to show you a clip from the documentary Venezuelans Under Siege, produced by my colleague here in the History Department, Kevin Young. This is a clip that shows an organizer from a cooperative speaking and their efforts to work with farmers in the countryside to bring food into the cities.
La experiencia es que en el año 2016 las compañeras y los compañeros que hacíamos parte de la cooperativa empezamos a sentir que cada día estábamos comiendo menos, ¿no? Que digamos que la ropa que teníamos 3 años o 4 años que no nos poníamos empezó a cerrarnos el pantalón, ya la camisa no nos ajustaba tanto y empezamos a ver, digamos, una disminución no solamente en la cantidad de comida, sino en el tipo de comida a la que podíamos acceder. Y fue justamente esa coyuntura la que nos impulsó a organizarnos en este proceso, digamos, para que además pudiéramos también limitar el nivel de dependencia nuestra respecto de las bolsas del CLAP. Nosotros reconocemos que la bolsa del CLAP es un esfuerzo muy importante que viene haciendo el gobierno nacional por disminuir los impactos del bloqueo, pero creemos que el poder popular no puede simplemente reducirse a esperar a que venga una bolsa. Esta iniciativa, digamos, además de responder a una de las necesidades más sentidas que tenemos en Venezuela en este momento, que es el acceso a alimentos, digamos, también es una estrategia de organización y de politización frente a la crisis, ¿no? Nosotros desde la cooperativa y desde el colectivo Urgentes creemos que, digamos, el socialismo en el territorio se construye a partir de construcción de poder desde abajo, de fortaleza fortaleciendo los procesos organizativos. Decidimos que no estábamos esperando simplemente que las soluciones vinieran desde arriba, desde la dirigencia, desde el gobierno, sino que nosotros y nosotras como sujetos políticos nos organizamos para, digamos, transformar la crisis en posibilidades de organización, de politización.
Thank you. I will now like to turn to our panelists to invite Alejandra and Liz to show their lovely faces. And for our audience, as we speak, you're welcome to send us questions through the Q&A in the chat box. Welcome, Liz and Alejandra. It's such a pleasure to have you both here with us. So we'll start with Liz. Liz, could you please tell us about the impacts of the US blockade against the Cuban people, and specifically how it impacts women and Black people on the island?
Hi, thanks for having me tonight. Well, as I said, the blockade, the sanctions impact of all of Cubans, not only the Cubans that live in the Cuba right now, also the Cubans that are around the world. Because the concept of the blockade, sanctions at the beginning was like strangling Cuban people once in order that in some point we raise against our government. But this is now 60 years of blockade, and that's dream, that's expectation that US government has doesn't happen, right? So the sanctions affect the Cubans that live in Cuba and also the Cubans that live outside of Cuba. Depends of gender, depends of race, depends of class, is how the blockade is going to affect you more or less, depending if you live in Cuba or depends if you live outside of Cuba. All that are factors that trying to that limit or reinforce the effects that the sanctions have in us. For example, as entrepreneur in Cuba, private sector, how the blockade affect them. The US government, the officials of the US government also said that the blockade is only for the Cuban government and not for the Cuban people. And they support the entrepreneurs and the private sector in Cuba. But when you cut the tourism and when you're trying to forbid the tourism from the US around the world coming to Cuba, you are affecting the private sector and the entrepreneurs. For example, all the laws that the Trump administration started, and at some point the Biden administration keeps alive, are stopping that tourism, not only from the US, also tourism for around the world coming to Cuba. The last chapter of this persecution is about ESTA program. These are kind of sanctions that US citizens that come to Cuba first in a margin of 10 years isn't allowed for them to come back to the United States because they visit a country that is known as support of terrorism. It's a funny list that US government create for his enemies. And this is a kind of lie that a lot of people around the world is trying to stand up and say that this is a lie, that Cuba supports terrorists. But in the fact that we are in that list that make us more vulnerable than we already are. Also, the US sanctions affects programs as education programs, healthcare programs, access to internet. For example, someone asked me in order to be in this webinar, I need to use a VPN because it's not allowed for Cubans that live in Cuba use a platform as Zoom, Google Meets, Notion, Amazon. Right now the list is really long, understand. It's ridiculous because this is kind of access of education programs that we don't have because we are Cubans and because we live in Cuba. Also, I can access to libraries around the world because my IP address is in Cuba, is in La Habana. For example, this affected directly people who needs to find books for university students, or people who works for informaticians, people who works develop software or programs that they can't even access to that kind of program that help them to increase and to develop their business or their work here in Cuba. And also, another example is healthcare. And this is something that really hurts Cuban people because we have one of the best medicine programs around the world. For example, during the COVID pandemic, Cuba has to make its own vaccines in order to vaccinate the entire population, because COVAX, that is a program designed for United Nations to vaccinate poor countries, told us that we are not applied as a poor country, so we need to pay for the vaccines, and Cuba don't have that kind of that kind of money. So we decide with a small amount of money that we already have, trying to develop our own vaccines, and we do not only but 3 vaccines that are active against COVID. When our scientists institution and biotechnology institutions trying to buy raw materials in order to develop these vaccines, they say no, they keep it waiting for weeks. That's the principal reason that we have to wait more time that we are designing at the beginning for. This is something that I don't know how to say, retrasar. This is something that makes that our people have to wait more time in order to get vaccinated, because the raw materials that we asked for buying, that was expressed in sign that is going to be used for vaccines in Cuba, and they say no, and they make us waiting for weeks, was the cause that our biggest high peak of COVID in the summer of 2021. This is not only raw material for development of vaccines, it's also syringes, ventilators, gloves, and all kinds of supplies that we need to improve our health system. And this is something that is pretty close to me because my mom is a doctor and my sister is a doctor too. Both of them was working the first line during the COVID pandemic. Well, the other thing that is really that I want to say here is the sanctions reinforce the patriarchal system. Why? Because they are designed to attack the state sector, but they don't realize that the 80% of the people who works in Cuba works for the government. And the most of the people that work for the government, the majority are women. So the sanctions affect them directly because, for example, the women, I'm so sorry. The women represent 71% of the professionals in the healthcare system. They are the 60% in education system, and also they are the 53% of workers who works in science and innovation, for example, biotechnology, and the 84% of there are women also who works in labs, develop vaccines and drugs for medicines for Cubans and also for the world. So you can imagine if they're the biggest work, of course, in these sectors are women. This idea that the U.S. government with the sanctions wants to, this sector fails, at the end, the blockade wants the women fields. Also because not only directly to health, educations, biotechnologies, also because during the sanctions caused a lot of scarcity, and women are, the most of them are head of the households. So imagine you need to work, and in your work, you don't have the supplies, you don't have the tools that you need for work because of blockade and the sanctions. And when you are home, you need to work more because you need to think what I am in cook, what the children needs a lot of things, that drugs, medicine that we don't have. So we employ more than 45% hours dedicated only to take care of house and take care of the children, because the majority of these tasks are on the shoulder of the women. So they need to think, and they need to deal with the scarcity and the enormous crisis that Cuba has, and they need to figure out how to resolve all these problems in their homes and also in their professional careers.
Thank you so much, Liz. I think that's really important for folks to understand of how the blockade intensifies women's labor, because they're the ones responsible for the survival of their families. And we'll talk more about this during the Q&A. I'm going to switch over to Spanish to ask Alejandra a question now. Alejandra, bienvenida. Una pregunta.
Alejandra, welcome. I have a similar question for you regarding how did the blockade or the sanctions against Venezuela affect women and children in Venezuela? Thank you everyone for having me here today and for trying to communicate the situation here in Venezuela, which sadly is not very different from that in Cuba, as Liz put it. This is the kind of scheme that is imposed on those populations that dissent from what the US expects. So maybe my response is, how does this not affect us? It affects our everyday in every aspect. Every aspect of life's production and reproduction is affected. Everything Liz explained, we live here too. We are surviving more than 400 sanctions that have been imposed unilaterally by the US. It affects our right to free trade. It affects our freedom to carry out international bank transactions. It keeps us from buying the things we need to continue developing as a country. It is a sanction that affects development itself. Our lives are traversed by these sanctions. Sometimes they tell us that they started in 2014, 2015, 2017, but really what we're living began when Chavez won the elections. And we can see that, in fact, in 2002, after 2 or 3 years that Chavez came to power, we were subject to a coup d'etat that was carried out with the support of the US. And since then, we've been oppressed more and more. And this oppression, it tries to asphyxiate us. in 2014, I think the U.S. government undoes its masks, shades it off, and announces publicly these coercive measures that affect our international trade abilities, and the blockades begin. They have blockades for our production of oil. That is the basis of our economy, right? Our ability to sell that oil abroad, and that of course affects our economy. In international media, and every time the US announces a new sanction, they say it's not against the people, but we have to acknowledge that we are the objective when we are the victims, and women, we are particularly oppressed objective or target of these sanctions and this war, because our everyday is affected, our very lives, our will to continue the revolution, and all of this energy that we could put in to other projects, we have to direct into surviving, getting food, medicine, transportation, everything we need for daily life. Our effort is multiplied 10 times or more. In 2014, when these sanctions become publicly announced, grocery shopping took me 45 minutes every week. And this is taking into account staying in line to access the shops, etc. It took me 8 hours after the sanctions, and I couldn't even get everything I needed for my family. Of course, the Venezuelan government is trying to enact some programs that support people. There's one that it's called clapbacks, and that provides some food that is non-perishable, but they still are not enough. These programs are not enough, and these programs are also the target of this sanction war. We have the case of Saad, that is a Colombian citizen of Arabic origin, and he was an intermediary to buy some of the food that went into that those clapbacks, and he was incarcerated or deprived from his freedom, and we're requesting him to be released. Coercive measures keep us from buying groceries, but it also affects our ability to produce our own food, because the government and other entities, public or private, whichever, they cannot buy the seeds they need, they can't buy the machinery we need, they can buy the necessary things to produce food. And you'll say, well, it's been 20 years, why are we still here? Well, we have to tie this to the technological dependency that that's been imposed on us years before the revolution. Our very own oil corporation, before these coercive measures, was considered one of the biggest, most productive companies when it came to oil production, but this company is now incapacitated. We cannot buy everything we need to keep this company up to date. And we cannot buy either the necessary chemicals to process our oil and sell it. We have the same situation in education, in medicine, in arts, in our ability to access financial programs. Beyond numbers, I like to mention life stories, things that we've lived through and experienced. A few years ago, I went with a colleague from the movement whose mother had a kidney disease, and I lived with her the desperation of her family and other families that were there because they couldn't go through dialysis as they needed. And it was really desperate and despairing, because the ship that brought the necessary equipment was retained, and its cargo was taken in Colombia. And that crisis finally was resolved. But my friend's mother is one of the victims of the blockade, because my friend's mother died a few months after. It is really hard then to count the victims of this war, because they are not direct victims, let's say, right? When we have a war with like weapons, a bomb drops and we can count the human losses and the economic losses. But here, it's really hard to keep count. It's very diffuse. They talk about 40,000, 150,000, because, for instance, a hypertense patient who dies a few months later after he wasn't able to get his medication, it's really hard to account. It's really hard to account for that. Like my mother's friend who died not because she couldn't access the dialysis, but because the dialysis came late, her body was tired, and she was also very stressed, right? The stress of not knowing if the next time she would be able to access her treatment. And this happens in hospitals. It also happens with people who are about to give birth. They don't have the resources to confront or to face any complications in birth giving. So this war that we know as coercive sanctions that are unilateral, we don't usually recognize it as a war itself, but this is a war against the people, against the women who support life in our communities.
La vivimos fuertemente.
And we live it in our flesh. I can't think of any aspect of life that hasn't been touched by this situation. It doesn't exist. Everything is affected by it. And to talk a little bit about what this means for us as a people,
me identifico mucho con eso, que es un castigo colectivo que se nos está.
I identify with this idea of this as a collective punishment. We're being collectively punished in the present, as a people, in the present and the future, just because of somebody's desire, just because of our desire to exercise our own sovereignty, our desire to be free our desire to think our future according or in our own terms. And this is what we want to tell the whole world, that we want a right for self-determination, self-determination of our own, the government and the type of government we want, the self-determination when it comes to our economy. We don't want to export this as any kind of model. We don't want to impose this to other people. And that is the only justification for what the US government is doing to us, who has declared us as a menace, as a threat to the American people. And also, well, one thing that we joke about here in Venezuela, imagine a small country like ours, not even 30 million inhabitants. We don't have an army. We don't have like a big army. After we fought for independence from the Spanish Empire, we have never waged war with anybody in the whole world, any other country. We have never been involved in any war in the world. How can we be a threat, an extraordinary threat? I think the only way to see this is, well, what might be a threat for the US government and other transnational enterprises, its empire that it tries to impose on the world, is that a country, a people so small like us, the fact that we might be able to say, we don't want what you impose, we want to dream otherwise, do things otherwise. I think what they're scared of is that we might achieve our dream of being a sovereign, free, just country. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandra. I think I'm really sorry about your friend's mother's death. I've been really impacted by your words. Thank you, Liz and Alejandra, for sharing the pain of these economic wars and the human cost of them. So I'm going to change to English.
Liz, I'd like to ask you about, what does queer and feminist organizing look like in Cuba in response to the blockade, or perhaps in response to the symptoms of the blockade?
Well, I have two words for that. The first one is resilience, and the second one is sorority. We are trying to create organizations, movements, initiatives that be intersectionally, that don't care also about women. We take also about Black women, trans women. We are trying to create a space that feels safe for everybody, and a space that we can support each other in the communities. So this is the kind of movement, initiative, organization that work in the communities at the base with the people who are the most vulnerable, elder ones, children, and women. There is a part of women that don't work for the government. They have like an informal job. So they work at the neighborhood selling things or whatever. So we are trying to work in community with that women that also suffer violence, gender violence. They also have survived at the margins of these sanctions, because it's true that Cuba has one of the most programs that take account women. We have really powerful social justice programs that help to empowerment women, Black people and queer people. But we are also a patriarchal country. We are also a racist country. We are also a country that needs to improve and to keep develop the most of the programs that we have. So imagine in a society that is affected all the time for the sanctions and the blockade, that the women and Black people are at the base of this triangle. So they suffer the most the impact of the sanctions. That's why are so powerful and so necessary initiatives like, for mentions, one of them are Casa Tomada Mirarte, Nosotros, Afrodiverso, La Muñeca Negra, El Club del Espendrú. They are also, this is our kind of initiative that grow out in the neighborhoods, in poor, vulnerable neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, that trying to build alliance between them in order to have, like, for example, workshops about menstrual cups, or workshops about gender violence, workshops about arts that we are trying to teach the women, the young people and the children who live in these kind of neighborhoods, arts, in order that they create a better and learn a better different ways to survive at this kind of enormous crisis that we are pushed to survive every day. This is not the solution. We don't have the solution for the crisis, the solution for the crisis, for the blockade of the sanctions, because this is not something that we can fix at the enter of the country. This is something that the US government needs to fix, not us. So in some points, it kind of frustrating for us, because all the time we are trying to create this initiative in order to build a better future for us, and also for the people, for the children that came after us, behind us, but it's difficult. So our reach is only trying to do better, try to improve our life in a really creative way, because we don't have the solution for the crisis. Alejandra said something that I was thinking about, that is this, that the sanctions is in place for many years, and the strategic is the same for many years. This is something keeping in the same since many years. This is something that I want to highlight, because, for example, in the case of Cuba, the sanctions has been in play for more than 60 years, but it's not the same sanctions. They are reinforced each year. So, for example, if the government have a plan A, that is, for example, sending doctors around the world trying to earn money because of that, they're going to attack the program that we are, the doctor program that we send around the world. So all the time, all the year, administration behind administration, they're trying to reinforce the sanctions. So the government goes, the plan B to plan Z in nothing. And they, many times they push the, I don't know how to say that in English, but in Spanish there is a phrase for that, ponerte entre la espada y la pared. This is a kind of phrase that said that you don't have any options to turn around in order to be, to create better solutions, because this is not a war against two countries that are really similar. This is a war against the most powerful country around the world, and a small island in the Caribbean that doesn't have resources. We can push back. We can hit back because it's so unequal. War is so unequal. Race. I don't know how to explain that, but the fact is that the small initiative that we can do on the ground bound, for example, with the vulnerable people in the neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, queer neighborhoods, are really small, are really, small in order to the impact so big that the blockade and the sanctions have in us.
Thank you, Liz, for that explanation. What I'm hearing from both you and Alejandra is just all of the labor that is imposed on to women and to queer people in order to survive, and that's going to then impact what feminist organizing looks like in Cuba. I'm just going to switch now to Spanish to ask Alejandra a question. Alejandra, una pregunta similar.
Alejandra, a similar question. In Venezuela, how have feminist and queer movements organized in response to the sanctions and the symptoms of the sanctions? Well, I would like to highlight that, well, one of the ways in which we have organized is around the belief that there's a common good, a collective good that is much more important than any benefits that we might get individually. And that this collective well-being is something that we seek after and that we try to protect, and that this is very much related to the future that we want to leave here for our kids and our children and their descendants. When the revolutionary process started, I was very happy because, well, I haven't told you, but I'm more than 50 years old, and I grew up during the economic crisis of the capitalist system of the 1990s. And I always thought that my generation was a hopeless generation. But Comandante Chavez and his revolution returned that hope to us. And when the revolution started, I thought, well, we made it. You know, I'm going to see it. I'm going to see this other world that is possible, and for which we as social movements are fighting and resisting. When the sanctions started, I thought, well, I won't see it, but my kids will. But as this gets, the sanctions get stronger, and this economic war first on, and I see what this has meant for my kids to grow up in these difficult circumstances. I'm telling them this that we're doing is not for us, is for those who are coming behind us, for the children of the future, and for the country, that we resist as collectively. Some people, when they come here and see us and tell us, like, how can you be so happy and joke around and sing and dance? Well, because we're resisting for the future. We believe in the future. We also believe in cooperation, in power, in the power of the collective to think through solutions. And that's the way we organize. We organize through small experiences, like Liz said, but we think that through small actions, we're constructing something bigger. And here we say that just a drop doesn't make rain, but that a lot of drops make rain, make a storm. And I think that's a metaphor for what makes us continue resisting. And well, we have to recognize the solidarity we receive from other peoples, from our sisters and brothers, from other countries like Cuba and Venezuela. There are many other countries that are undergoing the same situations. This U.S. of this methodology of the U.S. government. There are other countries that are undergoing similar circumstances. At least 17 countries, 17 peoples. Because here in Venezuela, we recognize that in the Venezuelan territory, there are several peoples coexisting. We're trying to organize, to think production and reproduction differently. And for me, it's very important to have spaces like this one. Comandante Chavez teaches us to separate governments from their peoples. One thing is that the government is one thing, and its interests, and the people is a different thing. The peoples around the world have really embraced us and helped us, supported us. And whereas the financial system is governed by financial transnational companies, and they sometimes collaborate with us, give us little morsels here and there. The important thing is other collectives and peoples who create spaces like this, who embrace us, who support us in many ways, who donate to us. The cooperation amongst us is fundamental inside Venezuela, as well as external cooperations. We have a lot of experiences and memories, small experiences like the one of the Yerbateras collective that started in the pandemic. It's an urban garden through which we think about and practice a form of production that is sustainable, that is direct. What we do is basically grow herbs, some medicinal herbs too, like spices. And we try to improve access to medicine with it. We also have a Coloquera fair that rehearses other ways of relating to production through exchange. We also participate and rehearse alternative forms of organizing, such as in places such as the communes. We try to have our local spaces, propose alternatives to the patriarchal, colonialist, racist, capitalist systems, all of these multiple oppressions. And we continue working. We go on. A friend from a colleague told me once, a woman much older than me, older than 70, she said, they try to make us give in through hunger. And the truth is that if something the capitalist system has taught us something, it has taught us to endure hunger. Hunger is not going to stop us. We find solutions anywhere. They are not gonna make us stop. We're very creative. We are very creative people. and we're always producing solutions. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandra. At this time, I want to invite you both to have a conversation, the three of us, so you can turn on both your cameras. And we're going to take some questions from the audience. There are many questions about how about ways in which the US people can support and be solidary with the Cuban people and the Venezuelan people. Okay, Alejandra goes first. Well, I would like to invite you all to organize yourselves within the US to raise your voices against the sanctions. More than, I don't know, donations are always welcome, but you have to organize yourselves within your own territories and multiply what we've told you here today and tell your governments we won't be accomplices in these sanctions, these measures that are genocidal, that are taking the lives of thousands and thousands of people around the world. Maybe I may sound crazy, but I want to invite you to make revolution. Stop them from saying that is not for your good as a people or for your benefit, that they are oppressing us. We have to unmask these governments who have applied these measures. It might be Trump, Obama, or whichever name. The one now.
Estamos aquí en Venezuela con que
on Saturday, by the way, he declared us a threat, an extraordinary and unusual threat for the US national security. Which, something I still don't understand, but well, organize yourselves. That don't let the government massacre other peoples in your name. Don't allow to
Alejandra said, no in your name and also not with your money. Because the most of the programs that are created by the government to destabilize countries like Cuba and Venezuela are with the money of the US citizens, with the taxes that you pay. So instead of giving that money to destabilize other countries, maybe it's going to be better to keep that money to improve a good public health care, a law against the guns in the United States. I don't know. I'm pretty sure that US government can find better ways to spend that amount of money. I'm not talking about a small amount of money. I'm talking about millions of dollars that are designated to destabilize for years countries like Cuba and Venezuela. And this is not something that is Republicans' fault, or this is not something that goes to Democrats' fault. This is a bipartisan issue. Everybody said that Trump was crazy. Everybody said that he was wrong, but the only two things that Trump did well during his periods, during his presidency, was the reinforcement of sanctions against Cuba, reinforcement of allowing sanctions against Venezuela. And this is not something that came both at the same time. Alejandra mentioned 2014 as the really bad year for Venezuelans. And I remember that year was announced that the Cuba and the US was trying to normalize relationship again. So sometimes when the relation with Cuba is going to be better. It's going to seems that maybe it's going to be better at some points. The sanctions against Venezuela are reinforced, and it's the same with Cuba. When the themes are better in between the two governments, Venezuela and U.S. government, the things against Cuba are worse. So it's a kind of balance, because there are a lot of money, a lot of interest against behind that kind of politics. The most important thing for me is raise your voice if you can. Also visualize our cause, our situation. And the third one that I recommend to you is visit our countries if you can. If you have the opportunity to talk with people. If you are an activist, please try to create an alliance with activists and trying to that are working so hard in Cuba in so many areas: feminism, anti-racist, LGBTQ initiative. There are a lot of them, and the most of us, we don't have like connections, we don't have bills, we don't have bridge with other initiatives in another part of the world, because the blockade, the sanctions, doesn't allow us to create better understanding, better connections, because we don't have access to the same platforms that already exist for women around the world. That's all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. I think you're absolutely right, especially for our listeners, mainly who are students, who are in tens of thousands of dollars in debt, because we live in a country where the US government spends all of its money on militarism in order to harm the Cuban, the Venezuelan people, and people throughout the global South, rather than tending to the needs, educational needs of its own population. In contrast to Cuba, where education is mainly free, even under the conditions of a blockade. I also want to point to the comments of an audience member, Miriam. If our tech team could put the link to a petition to take Cuba off of the terrorism list. We have another question related to this conversation about what can the US left learn about struggles in Venezuela and Cuba. Maybe Alejandra, and let me just switch to Spanish. Qué pena. Aquí en español, la pregunta es...
In Spanish, the question is, what should the left in the US learn from the left in Cuba and Venezuela, from the struggle in Cuba and Venezuela, especially because in the US, we don't have those experiments like communes or communal councils, things like that. It's very difficult, right? Because nobody learns from the experiences of others, right? I think the experiences we've had this 24, 23 years since the revolution, and everything that the foreign interference in our country, what I've learned from it is, well, not to tell people what to do. That's what I've learned. But what I could say is that look at yourselves. Look at how you're organizing yourself, how you're becoming a movement, and be self-critical. The solution for the people cannot be imposed from outside. The solution for the people's problems have to come from inside. Because I can tell you what has worked for us. I can also tell you a million things that haven't worked, but those experiences cannot be extrapolated necessarily. That I want to invite you to look at yourself, to examine yourselves, and to continue organizing. I know that because I have colleagues in the Women's March, and I know how other groups, how hard it is for them to get organized and to fight against a common sense that tells them that anything they think outside the box is impossible. That is the other thing that I can tell you. Anything is possible. Here in Venezuela and in Cuba, the Cuban people have shown that it is possible. After 70 years of blockade, yes, it is possible to have free education, excellent, by the way. It is possible after years of sanctions to keep fighting, to continue being happy and fighting and struggling. Yes, it is possible to turn back some things that we never thought that could be turned back. For instance, when everything started, when this war started, Venezuela was completely dependent on external and foreign agricultural production. And last year, we achieved complete sovereignty in our production of corn. We are producing our own seeds, we are sowing our own kids, making our own corn meal, and we're doing the same thing with potatoes, with other produce. When people decide to walk, it is possible. Liz, do you want to respond?
Pero creo que podemos seguir a otra.
Ok, genial. Solamente quiero recordarles a la
great. I want to remind you that we have local groups that are doing this anti-imperialist job. We have this organization, TASAN, in case you want to be part of these activities, of this solidarity. We have a question from our colleague Jorge. He wants to know what was the response of Cuban and Venezuelan governments against blockade. How were they able to survive for so many years? And a related question made by Gonzalo, I'm looking for it. What's your view on how politicians around the world have supported the US? What's your idea, your opinion about these countries in relation to the US politics?
A lot of persistence, I think so. It's really hard to describe the how, because the most of the time, I think so, it's not a question that is going to point to the government, it's a question that is pointing to Cuban people. Because, for example, right now, I'm living alone, so I have my house in my church, I need to pay my bills, I need to do the money, pay for things. I'm asking how my mom did this in the 90s, in the middle of a really big crisis and with a little girl by her own. How my mom did that, how my grandma did that without any support. I don't know, really. I don't know how they did that. I think a lot of creativity, a lot of resistance, a lot of resilience, a lot of new. I don't know. It's something that Alejandra was talking about. Don't give up. Don't give up, because in some point this is a thing that is going to pass. This is a thing that is going to end. So hope is help us believe that there is a future that is better in some point. That's the idea, the whole idea. And also, I think that a lot of this is I don't know okay, sometimes strategies that maybe works and sometimes not. So you need to be resilient all the time. You need to be open to change the way you do the things. And for me, that's the point, resilient. And sometimes I get angry with foreigners say, because you are so resilient, Cubans are so resilient. I say, we are not so resilient. We need to be resilient. We have to in order to survive. So at some point, we get tired to be resilient and we ask for a better life. As a young people, we ask for a better future inside the country. I don't want to leave my country in order to have a better future. This is not something that applies to Cuba, Venezuela. This is something to apply to Colombia, El Salvador, Honduras, República Dominicana, Haiti. That's not only the effects that the sanctions have in Cuba or Venezuela, that's the country, as imperialism country as the United States has in Latin America. So maybe this is something that we need to figure out how to change, how to do the things different, how I all the time trying to question myself. I all the time trying to question the news that I get from different press about Cuba, because it's pretty easy to point out the government for all the things that in Cuba doesn't work, because the blockade, the sanctions, they don't have a face. It's just something that is really big, but this is not something that you can point with your finger. So the major responsible for the situation for the most of the people are the Cuban government, and because they need solutions, because they are so tired to survive instead of have a better life. But this is not something that Cubans are suffering because the sanctions is something that imperialism is something that the whole Latin America is suffering in the same place.
Yeah, and to add to your point, Liz, something that really impacted me when I went to Cuba and I spoke with you was also your analysis about tourism in the private sector. So for people who are less familiar, in order to survive the blockade, the Cuban government has had to rely more on tourism and the private sector. And we know what tourism in the private sector does around the world. It increases inequalities. And so when you go to tourist places in Cuba or in Havana, where I was, you really see like who is going to be hired to serve tourists. They tend to be light-skinned or white Cubans. And so all these inequalities get reproduced in terms of who has access to dollars. And I know that folks who are to the left of the Cuban government are very critical of this approach to relying on tourism in the private sector. And the Cuban government is put in a really impossible situation where you're an island in an ocean of capitalism. How else do you survive? So these questions about how Cuba survives, I think, is really important for all people around the world, and especially for leftists, of what does a transition to socialism look like when you're faced with so many attacks. Liz, of course, you're welcome to add. I just wanted to share that because I was really impacted by that analysis that you had when we were at a restaurant. And you're like, look around you, who's serving us? It's not going to be Black people who are hired in the private sector.
Yeah, that's it. Because the most of the Black people or the most of the women are employed to state sector that belongs to the government. Because, for example, when you're a woman and you are working for the government, you have like when you are pregnant, you have like a year full pay. You have in order that you take care of your children. Also, you have a lot of benefits that the government gives to you. But in the private sector, the first question that they ask to you is, you have any child? You have children? How old are you? How white are you? If you are white enough, you are working with the face to the public in the private sector. If you're Black, maybe you work in the bathroom or as a security guard, because they are trying all the time. They are like imitating the capitalism. This is something that I'm really care about it, because this is a phenomenon that maybe we need to pay more attention in order to that is driving us crazy and make us withdraw, working back all the process that we are gaining year after year of revolution in Cuba. But that's the way that the government planned in order to survive. But it's true. The private sector in Cuba is wide, and and have only men faces on it. So find a black women trying to be entrepreneur with trying to overcome all the obstacles that they have is really difficult. And also it's really difficult because most of the people that are owners in the business live in Cuba and live in the US. So they keep two citizenships, Cubans and Americans. They travel a lot between two countries, but they don't spend that money here. They take the money back to the United States and they live really unhappy in Miami. And they have zero benefits, like vacations, no, 8 hours, no, women, no. So we need to pay more attention to that because in order to survive to the sanctions, we are lose some things that we don't know how to do anymore. So we don't have right now a solution for that problem because we have a bigger problem that is survive the sanctions, keep the money going. So it's difficult and certainly it is a really challenge that Cuba has.
Gracias, Liz. Oh, sorry, I'm in the English channel. Let me go to Spanish. Alejandra, una pregunta similar de cuál ha sido
A similar question for you, Alejandra. What has been the response of the Venezuelan government and how useful were these responses? This is a difficult question, but the key is how to construct your response. You see, when you ask Liz about the government, the response is we the women, and this is something we have to pay attention to, and this is something we have to think about instead of what the media is showing. On one hand, we have the government, and on the other hand, we have the people. So we have a government that is supported by a people. And the Venezuelan government, in order to face all these issues, provide support like the bolsas. So these are bags that they give you. There is usually around 20 kilograms of food, of dry food, and they give that every 21 days. And they have different programs that with these programs, they want to help people and to support people. Also, I don't know if you have noticed that Maduro, he says that he would prioritize the needs of the people. He's trying to continue with the plans like the Misión Vivienda, which is a program for housing, and they have built thousands of houses around the country. He's also trying to keep alive a system, a health system, and try to avoid privatization at all costs. And also what Liz was saying, you have to negotiate some things. Sometimes the revolutionary people, they question some things. People who are here, we have a revolution, and we have a radical revolution that goes to the root of the problem
las razones estructurales de la...
A revolution that goes towards that is institutionalized oppression. And this process, we see that they are really slow. The priority is in surviving. And that's for the government and also for the people. We need to survive, first of all. And social movements focus on that, on surviving. And we have to pay attention to this. A lot of our energy goes towards that, towards surviving.
Gracias, Alejandra.
Thank you, Alejandra. I'm going to switch to the English channel.
So we have about 5 more minutes. So Liz, I'm going to ask you a really big question. And since I know you have to go soon. So for context, in July of 2020, 2021, there were big protests in Cuba in response to scarcity and blackouts of electricity. In the US, there was a lot of commentary that people should support the overthrow of the Cuban government in order to address anti-Black racism, because the Cuban government is anti-Black and therefore a coup should be supported. How would you respond to that? And that's one of the questions from one of our audience members.
Yeah, the question is, I answer right with another question. If you're a counter government, what kind of government do you want to have to place in order to replace the old one? I have a lot of demands to do for my government. I love questions for my government, but in this point of my life, seeing all these white Cuban American talking, like if we're talking about in representation of the Cubans that are not represented at all, because they even put a foot in Cuba, I was asking no. My answer is no, because this is a government that, of course, they have a lot of polls that they have made a lot of mistakes during a lot of years. This is not a perfect government. This is not a perfect country. But it's worth it. So this is worthy to fight for it. It's worthy to try to build a better country, a better future. That another kind of government that I don't know what is the purpose that they have, where if they take account of Black people, if they take account queer, transgender people, I don't know. I don't think so, because of the same people that are trying to support Cuban Americans in Florida, they're trying to that. For example, that's the kind of people that support that in Florida. There is a law that forbidden to children to be taught about Afro history, Black people history. But that's the same people that support that in Florida, people can teach children about gender or whatever. This is a really conservative people. And of course, they have another Cuba, but they don't have a Cuba that I can fit in. This is not a Cuba that my friends, queer friends, transgender women, Black people, vulnerable people can fix in it. So no, my answer is no. I really want to improve a lot of things in my country. I just ask a lot of demands to my government. But this government, this situation in this country is good enough to start a new revolution.
Thank you.
New process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. And I think this goes to Alejandra's point of what she's asking us to do here for folks who live in the heart of empire, that we need to take a good look at ourselves in the mirror. And what kind of feminism are we trying to build? Will we build a feminism that will be for the liberation of all people within and outside US borders? Or do we have a bankrupt definition of feminism that sees the right of white capitalist women to loot and to bomb the global South? And one of our Cuban comrades said that to me. She said, if there is a coup supported in Cuba, in Venezuela, who do you think will put forth the bodies? It will be Black people, it will be queer people, it will be leftists, it will be working people. So that is the responsibility that we as feminists in the United States have, to be in solidarity with Latin American feminists and beyond. So I'll leave it there. I want to give a very special thank you to Liz, to Alejandra, for all of your intellect and your heart. And I want to leave you with resources in the chat so that you can learn more about feminist anti-capitalist struggles, that you can learn more about the Anti-Imperialist Action Committee and the Trans Asylum Support Network, and that we also have links to donations to support Cuban comrades who are doing autonomous organizing, who are processing plastic so that they can build dignified homes for working class people in their neighborhoods. So take a look at all of those resources. We're going to conclude with a really awesome video that Alejandra shared of this artist named Anarquía, Guerreras Unidas. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll go to Spanish. Muchísimas gracias a nuestra audiencia.
Thank you so much to everyone that was here today. Thank you so much.